Hi people. I've just seen a video of Admiral Tony Radakin of the Royal Navy. He is currently the chief of the UK Defence Staff. It rotates between the three forces, but he is currently the chief, basically the head of the British military. And he had some interesting thoughts about the situation in Ukraine. In his view, Russia has lost this strategically. He's pointed out that Russia has failed in its initial objectives, which was to basically take over the country within 30 days, take over its major cities. Russia's had to scale back and scale back. There is ferocious fighting going on in the east, obviously, in Donetsk and Luhansk. But I think at this point, even firstly, I agree with Admiral Radakin. I think his assessment is correct, and it's not just a case of, well, he's a military man, so he's going to put on a brave face and say that. I think the facts speak for themselves. I mean, if we look at NATO in 2022 and Russia in 2022, I think it's very obvious that NATO is stronger in every plausible way, um, especially with Sweden and Finland joining up. Incidentally, countries that have been pushed towards NATO by Russia's aggressive antics, as the president of Finland said. Now, pro Kremlin people will say, oh, this shows that Russia's under threat. But they fail to introspect, they fail to recognize that it's Russia's aggressive behavior that is pushing countries away from it. I mean, it's this absurd logic Kremlin apologists have, which is that Russia feels threatened in their mind. Russia is surrounded by NATO. Actually, if you look at Russia's land border, the vast majority of Russia is in Asia. There's actually a relatively small portion of the Russian land border actually borders NATO. And Russia, needless to say, is a vast country, um, which has always actually been, ironically, one of its weaknesses. It's almost too big to govern. But that lie that it's surrounded by NATO and it feels scared, it just needs to defend itself from NATO, has been proven false. Um, because NATO has not attacked Russia. It's the other way around. Um, Russia has attacked a smaller neighbor. Russia has threatened the stability of a continent. Putin's mouthpiece is on state TV, even if they're not speaking officially for the Kremlin. They're certainly not. The Kremlin certainly doesn't distance itself from them. I'm talking about those sort of ultranationalists who claim that they should march into Berlin or flatten British cities. I mean, they're hysterical fanatics, and I think they know that it's all hot air because they know if things were to escalate to the worst extent, i.e., a nuclear war, it would be mutually assured destruction because whilst Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile and could probably destroy several cities, there would be an obligation to respond. Several Russian cities would be destroyed, and we'll be talking millions dead within days. Um, it would just be unfeasible. It would be absolute insanity. Um, I think Putin's bad, but I'm not sure that he's mad. Um, but behind all this bravado that Russia's putting on, I think honestly, Putin and his cronies are smarting. I think they know that they're losing, or at least that they've been badly humiliated. Russia's not lost yet. It's always been this mentality of the Russian regime that they are prepared to sacrifice thousands of their own soldiers for whatever the agenda is of the leader in Moscow, whether it be Stalin during the war or Putin now. I mean, there's so many awful things about this war, as there is in any war, but one of them is the fact that thousands of young Russian soldiers are dying in vain. They really are, because there's no greater good that they're fighting for. Ukrainian soldiers are also dying. It's also tragic, but at least they have the moral argument on their side. Um, they've died defending their country. But there's there's just no sense in what Russia has done. I mean, there's sense in it insofar as it, based on Putin's irredentist worldview, this idea of reclaiming lost Russian land as he sees it, making up for historic humiliation. China, incidentally, kind of operates in a similar way. This idea of a century of humiliation in China, um, you know, it's almost like foreign policy conducted through bitterness, and it's a rather toxic way to look at the world. Um, but the fact of the matter is, after the Cold War, it felt humiliated. The Yeltsin years are remembered for stagnation and high crime, although he was a Democrat. So it's understandable. I mean, this video is not for a full assessment of Putin, but um, there'll be a lot to say when he passes, and there is serious rumors about his health right now. Serious speculation about his health, actually, not just rumors. Um, but the fact of the matter is, when Putin first got in, it's understandable. He was dynamic. He was relatively young, and even in the West, there was some optimism that he might be a pragmatic leader the West could work with. In the last 20 years, Putin has shown himself to be a tyrant, an obsessive tyrant who has utterly trampled freedom at home. Yes, he enjoys a lot of support, but a lot of that is to do with the personality cult that his regime has put into Russia. So is it a sincere love for Putin, or is it that people really just have no other perception? Because Russia's not a democracy. Its presidential elections may technically involve more than one party, but it's a facade. Um, so there's nothing good about the situation in Ukraine, even if Ukraine wins, which I hope it does, and I believe there is a chance that it will. It would kind of be a bittersweet victory, I think, for Ukrainians, because on one hand, um, a victory is a victory, and they will have got rid of the invaders. On the other hand, I think the generational anger and pain will last a very, very long time. I mean, you can't kill thousands of people, destroy a country, and just expect people to move on overnight. A Ukrainian who's lost their entire family to Russian forces is understandably probably going to hate Russia and all things Russian. So there's going to be real bitterness for generations, and it's all down to Putin. Innocent Russians are going to be stigmatized as a result, and it's wrong, but I think it's going to be a little bit like after World War II, when Germans were sort of had to tread a little bit carefully, right up until the 1970s in this country, still quite strong anti-German sentiments because people remembered the Blitz. Um, so I think in Ukraine, there's going to be very deep animosity towards Russia for years to come. Even if whoever succeeds Putin is a reformer and a true Democrat, he, or less likely she, is really going to have to there'll probably have to be some sort of reparations. Um, a lot of this stuff, of course, is idealistic, whether or not it actually happens. I mean, I don't think for a second that Putin is ever going to be tried for war crimes. Um, I don't think we'll ever see Putin and Lavrov in the dock like the Nuremberg war criminals, because as serious as the Ukraine situation is, it's not yet a global war. It has the potential of becoming one. It's not quite at that level. It's um, It's almost like, well, in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, that was, of course, the start of the European War. But the difference was Germany's advance moved very fast. As much as the Polish resistance were very brave, Germany did move very fast. And as we know, other countries fell shortly afterwards. The difference this time is Russia isn't advancing as much as Germany did. I don't think that's because it doesn't want to. I think given half a chance, Russia will attack the Baltic states and other countries. It's just that strategically they just can't at the moment. Um, they can't. I mean, the whole world, at least the whole sane world, has been inspired by the courage of the Ukrainians. But this goes on, and every day there's more suffering. It's horrible. It's horrible. suffering of the Ukrainians, certainly. But dare I say, I do sympathize with ordinary Russian troops to an extent. I'm not talking about those who willingly commit atrocities like rape women and kill civilians in cold blood. I'm talking about those who are basically treated like um, numbers. I mean, being a Russian soldier must be one of the worst jobs in the world because it's notoriously um, just lacks in terms of the command structure is not there's no like this is not working, so let's check the chain of command. It's like everything comes from the top and that's it, no questions asked. There's no sort of assessment, there's no sense of introspection. And obviously I don't know everything that goes on the ground, but that's the impression one gets. It's just stubborn, dogged thing. And that is where there's similarities between Hitler and Putin. Both dictators had this arrogant, dogmatic sense of this is the final goal and we will do everything to get to it. We don't care how many of our own people die. It's psychotic, actually. Um, so, with some luck, there'll be some huge backlash in Russia against the number of casualties that are mounting. Of course, they're downplaying what the true toll is. It may well be that Ukraine is exaggerating what the true toll is. I think it's very, very plausible that Russia, I was going to say Ukraine, that Russia has indeed lost thousands and thousands of troops. Um, I think it's very plausible, which is more than it lost in 10 years in Chechnya, including the insurgency there. So, the point of this video is just to kind of reiterate that point, that this idea that the mighty Russian military is somehow winning. I mean, you will get Russia apologists, right? I'm disappointed to see a lot of them are from Africa and Asia because I think they think that they're kind of having this anti-West stance. And the only reason they support Russia is because it's anti-West. I don't think they've anything necessarily against Ukraine. Um, they're just foolishly supporting Putin because he's anti-West, and they've got an agenda against the West. Because of, in the case of Africa, I think there's still a lot of vindictiveness over colonialism, and there's issues there. There's no getting away from it. So I would put it to those people, and I'm not generalizing here, but I would put it to those people that Russia's not your friend. Look at the behavior of the Wagner Group in Mali and other countries. Um, Russia, like China, is solely interested in Russia and China's vested interests. Um, and if your issue is racism, if you believe that Ukraine's Nazi, I mean, look at the way Russia treats its minorities. Um, Countries like India too, their record on this is questionable. I actually feel that the West needs to be quite assertive about this. I feel that Ukraine should certainly take a record of who is supporting it and who isn't. And when this thing ends, hopefully, if the Ukrainian economy can be rebuilt and it can be reconstructed, I mean, it's the country's been shattered, but if it can rebuild itself, hopefully with huge international investment, I think Ukraine should basically give the cold shoulder to those countries that so shamelessly appeased Russia and, in some cases, backed Russia. Having said that, even China has been kind of flip flopping on its support. I mean, it's never ever going to back the West over Russia. That's never going to happen. I do think Russia's somewhat surprised that China hasn't been more forceful in its support. Sure, the CCP will claim they're not taking sides or they'll even make pro Russian statements, but I think it's been fairly muted. I think what's happening with China is they're just watching the situation to see what are the implications on how the world responds to Russia because they're looking at Taiwan. Now, the difference is China is a much stronger economy than Russia. China arguably is a more powerful country overall. I would actually say in 2022, the most powerful country is still the United States, challenges that it has. Second, I would say China. Third, I would have said Russia a while back. But honestly, I think Russia has been severely damaged. Um, then we get into the great powers Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, and so on. um, India. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing is it's tragic. I think Ukraine will prevail, but what a cost! Thousands and thousands of lives, generational resentment. It's a terrible cost. That expression, "there's no winners in war," it's kind of true because even if Ukraine wins and expels the invaders, it will be a moral victory. But I think for many Ukrainians, that will be very. It'll be a bit like VE Day here. We see that as a very jubilant occasion, but someone who lost their brother or their husband on Day, that would have been a kind of bittersweet. The war is over, but he's gone or she's gone. Civilians who died in the blitz and so on. My point is, it's true there isn't really winners in war, but if Ukraine prevails, then the sacrifice of thousands of Ukrainians will not be in vain. If Ukraine is occupied, if Russia prevails, it's going to be, in my view, one of the biggest crimes of modern times. Well, it already is. The way Russia has degraded this country, I mean, talk about Nazis, the way Russia has questioned the very existence of Ukraine. And actually, that's also a point on analogies with Iraq. Yes, Britain and America invaded Iraq. It was an invasion of a sovereign country on very dubious justifications. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. But one key difference is that Britain and America never questioned Iraq's very existence as a nation state. They cited Saddam's brutality, they cited the weapons of mass destruction. It was a huge disaster and it seriously damaged both Britain and America's international reputation for a long time. Um, but I think that's the difference. Britain and America never said Iraq doesn't exist. Um, we're going to take it over and occupy it. It was a case of regime change, and it was a disaster. There's no point glossing that over. But I do think there are some differences, and that's one of them. Whereas Russia and the Putin regime literally questions the very existence of Ukraine as a nation state. Final word, and I won't make too much of this because I don't think they deserve it, but those people who live in the West, I mean, I expect it from Russian nationalists, right? They're fiercely nationalistic. That's what they're going to do. But when I hear British and American and Canadian Putin apologists, I want to vomit, quite honestly. I really, there are fewer people I have more contempt for. Why? Because I think the worldview is an insult to victims of Putin in Russia. And we're talking about Ukrainians, but also thousands of Syrians that the lying Putin regime backed up, um, aided by RT, I might add. But, you know, I just cannot understand if you're a British or American or Canadian citizen, or any European for that matter, defending a tyrant like Putin and defending Russian state lies, whatever your grievance is with our own governments, to sink that low, to actually become a stooge for that sort of regime, I think it's beyond despicable. I have zero respect for such people. I have no time for them. In our society, we have free speech. But I do think, I've said this before and I mean it, if you have someone who is in politics, if they're an elected member of parliament, if they are working in academia, particularly in sciences and those sort of fields, and especially the military, and they're taking pro-Russia positions, I honestly think they should be investigated for possible espionage. A regular Joe or Jill who's spouting off their support for Putin, it's not against the law, but I think they deserve all the stigma they get for being useful idiots. I've known a few people personally like this, and yeah, it's just not something I understand. I can understand being critical of Western governments. What I do not understand is going to the next level of actually endorsing and promoting proven Russian lies. The most obvious one is that the invasion was a special military operation. I mean, only two kind of people will regurgitate that line. Those who are complete fools, and those who, and they might not have other sources of information, or those who know it was a lie, but because of their ideological sympathies for Moscow, they'll just continue regurgitating it. They'll continue regurgitating the line that Russia's liberating Ukraine from Nazis. I've never said that there isn't far right components in Ukraine, by the way. Of course, there will be neo Nazis in Ukraine. Of course, there will be on some unsavory groups like the Azov division or the Azov battalion. I've never said that Ukraine doesn't have a problem with neo Nazis. My point is to extend from saying there is a problem with that to saying Ukraine is a Nazi country, to vilify it, um, is grotesque, utterly grotesque. Russia's also got neo Nazis. So, should European countries invade Russia to liberate it from its neo Nazis? It's just a grotesque lie. Um, and Russians are fed this crap. It's just, it's evil, actually, to vilify a country like that, to justify its brutal invasion and subjugation. Um, it's kind of like if a burglar goes into someone's house and then says, well, the homeowner is a terrible person. That justifies what I've done. It's nonsensical. So I really think such people deserve all the stigma they get. And if they are involved in some sort of national security situation, politics, the military, or an academic position where they have links to, for example, Russian institutions, this is certainly true of China, by the way. There are academics in Britain right now working with Chinese counterparts who have ties to the Chinese military. And they claim it's just research, but I really think I think the government should cut off funding for such people. And as for the likes of George Galloway, who so pathetically claims, I mean, he wanted to sue Twitter because they said his Sputnik network was not Russian state media, but there is no differentiation between Sputnik and RT. Sputnik, for goodness sake, named after the Russian rocket of 1957. Galloway is a disgrace. I think he's a demagogue. I think he's a liar. Um, he's a disgrace. So, and he's not the only one. Thankfully, they are a very small minority, but they're a very vocal minority. And the problem is when you have people like that who are convinced of their own dogma, it's it is what it is. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But I hope more than anything else that Ukraine prevails. Not because I take any pleasure from young Russian soldiers being killed, but because it just has to. It has to. And also, sooner Ukraine prevails and Russia limps out in defeat, the sooner the suffering will end on both sides. Well, it won't end. There'll be, the suffering will continue in terms of you can't imagine the PTSD, the generational pain, the reconstruction. But at least as soon as the war ends, that process can begin. Um, what would be the awful scenario here is if this rumbles on for years, like the Syria war. That would be awful. Okay, I'll wrap this up. But basically, I totally agree with Admiral Radakin. I think his assessment is correct. Russia has been humiliated. Um, Putin has been humiliated. And all those who, look at Tsar Vlad and adulate him online, they should really consider how this is going. They could believe all the lies they want, but Russia is losing. That's a fact. It's losing. I would suggest badly.